on behalf of the Nepal Institute for International Cooperation and Engagement and the Water Policy Center, of course. It gives me a great pleasure to extend a warm welcome to our distinguished speakers, chair, and participants who have joined this session. To chair this session, we have Professor Sumit Ganguly with us today. It is my great pleasure to introduce the chair. Professor Sumit Ganguly is a distinguished professor of political science and holds the Rabindranath Tagore Chair in the Indian Cultures and Civilizations at Indiana University, Bloomington, USA. Professor Ganguly has previously taught at James Madison College of Michigan State University, Hunter College, and the Graduate Center of the City's University of New York and the University of Texas at Austin. He has been a fellow at the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars in Washington, D.C., a visiting fellow at the Center for International Security and Cooperation at the Center on Democracy, Development and the Rule of Law at Stanford University, a guest scholar at the Center for Cooperative Monitoring in Albuquerque, and a visiting scholar at the German Institute for International and Area Studies in Hamburg. He has also held the Asia Chair at Sciences Po in Paris and the NG and Chair in International Politics at the Rajatnam School for International Studies at Nanyang Technological University in Singapore. In 2017-2018, he was a visiting professor at the Strategic Studies Institute of the U.S. Army War College. He will spend the summer of 2018 as an Alexander von Humboldt Fellow at the University of Heidelberg. Professor Ganguly is a senior fellow at the Foreign Policy Research Institute, a member of the Council on Foreign Relations, and a fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. He is an associate editor of International Security and serves on the editorial boards of the Asian Security, Current History, the Journal of Democracy, Foreign Policy Analysis, the India Review, the Non-Proliferation Review, Pacific Affairs, and Security Studies. He is currently at work on a book that focuses on the origins and evolution of India's defense policy for Columbia University Press. Without extending further, let me request Professor Sumit Ganguly to take charge of the session.
Thank you very much for that overly long and overly generous introduction. Just for the record, this year, because my term ran out, I finally stepped down as associate editor of both security studies and international security. So that's just a little update, but that's because they have term limits and you can only serve for so long. Without any further ado, we will get started, and I'm delighted that people were willing to accommodate the time in the United States because it's early evening already in India, and I suspect very early in the morning in Hawaii. In fact,
Indeed.
That's some ungodly hour in Hawaii.
2:15, 2:30, yeah.
Oh, good God. This is above and beyond the call of duty. I do not seem to have the roster in front of me. So Pramod, who are we supposed to begin with?
Sir, we can start with Ambassador Ashok Sazenhaar.
Okay. Ambassador, would you please start us off with your presentation in that event? Thank you very much for gracing this occasion.
Not at all. Thank you very much, Professor Ganguly, for being here, and fellow panelists and participants. Let me first of all thank and congratulate Dr. Pramod Jaiswal, NICE, and also WPC for putting this together. As I was mentioning to him, this really seems to be the Mahakumbh of international relations, because it is spreading over such a long period in terms of duration and also in terms of the number of issues that are being discussed. But I particularly commend him because for selecting this subject, this issue of discussing matters related to COVID-19 and what is going to happen in the post-pandemic order as and when it arrives, because there is so much of uncertainty, there's so much of confusion, and there are looming clouds of conflict and contestation that are hovering all around us. We see that there is intense global rivalry and deep distrust and lack of understanding among several major players in the world. So during this conference, at least over the last 2 days, we have heard very many different perspectives as far as COVID-19 is concerned. I'm going to be focusing on COVID-19 and multilateralism. Over the next 10 minutes or so that I have, I will consider whether multilateralism or has it been successful, or even if we were to break multilateralism into regionalism or plurilateral organizations, how have they acquitted themselves? If they have not been very successful, what is the reason? And going forward, what can be done to set it right? So I would imagine if you were to look at the response to the first question, is that multilateral and regional bodies have fallen far short of expectations. Before looking at that, let us see what has been the state of multilateral institutions in the pre-COVID period. Again, we would say not very good. We have been speaking for several decades, in fact, about reforms of the United Nations Security Council, that it does not reflect the reality of the world today. It is anachronistic to have 5 countries as permanent members with veto power. The world today is very different, not only in terms of membership of the United Nations, because when the UN took off, when it was established in 1945, it had 51 members and now it has 193 members. But also in terms of distribution of power, of relevance, significance, influence amongst the different players, that has undergone a huge change. We have been speaking about changing in the working procedures of the United Nations, as well as its agencies, the reform of the General Assembly, and of many of its constituent parts of the United Nations. So it has not been a perfect system. And then, of course, it was also dealt, it was also dealt my video seems to have stopped somehow.
We can hear you just fine.
Yeah, you can hear me. So I'm just trying to set my video if it can work out, but if it doesn't.
Yes, you can be seen, sir.
Okay. So we have also seen in terms of the assumption of office by President Donald Trump that he has not helped matters. He, right after coming to office, he withdrew from the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement. Of course, TPP is not either a UN agreement or otherwise related to the UN, but it's some sort of a plurilateral accord that had been established before his arrival. He withdrew from the climate change accord. He withdrew also from the Iranian nuclear deal. All of them were blessed by the United Nations, so to say. But these deficiencies notwithstanding, we have seen that whenever a crisis has appeared on the scene, the multilateral system has risen up to the task. Let me provide you with 2 examples. The first is in terms of the pandemic Ebola, which was 2014, 6 years ago. The public health emergency of international concern when that was announced by the WHO, immediately the UN Security Council got together and announced that this was a matter of a threat to global peace and security. It asked all the constituent countries, all the members countries, to do all that they could to deal with it. Now compare this with what has happened in the current context. In the current context, in the month of March, when the pandemic was raging at its worst, just on the 31st of January, if my memory serves me correctly, it had been declared as the public health emergency international concern. I think on the 11th of March, it was declared as a pandemic, but no meeting took place in the month of March 2020 because the chair at that time, China, it said that this issue goes beyond the mandate of the Security Council because it is a matter of health. It does not relate to peace and security in the world. So no meeting of the UN Security Council could take place in March. It took place only in April when the chairmanship of the UN Security Council changed to Dominican Republic. Incidentally, in March, when China said that it does not the mandate of the Security Council doesn't extend to dealing with issues like the coronavirus pandemic. It was supported in this by Russia and a permanent member and a non-permanent member, South Africa. This is just for information. But the meeting took place of the UN Security Council in April when Dominican Republic became the president on the 9th of April. But there also nothing much could really happen because there was too much of tussle between the United States and between China because China did not wish to mention what was the origin of this virus. So today, when we see that the total number of those affected is in the range of about 25 million, those who have died is in the range of about 850,000. Still, there is no resolution emanating from the UN Security Council on this issue. The other example that I would submit for your consideration is that of the economic crisis in 2008-2009. At that time, we know we had the G8 grouping that was on the scene, and that was very quickly expanded to G20. And G20 decided that $1 trillion should be allocated, should be assigned to the IMF and to the World Bank to take care of the problems, particularly as far as the developing countries are concerned. Nothing of this nature has taken place this time, although the G20 met once on the 26th of March at the instance of Prime Minister Modi. But not much of a decision could be taken except that the WHO needs to be strengthened, that the debts of the developing countries, they need to be waived off. But there was no package of the nature that we were able to put together in 2009. And I think the magnitude of the problem today being such that we really need something like $2.5 trillion, if not more, to provide to all the countries. I think more than 100 countries have approached the IMF and the World Bank for assistance and for debt relief. Of course, the UN Secretary General could also set up a body, could take an initiative in this direction, but he has also not been forthcoming. The World Bank and IMF have come out with reports to suggest that the global economy will go down by about 5% or so. Different countries are going to contract at different rates. The United States at about -8%. But these are horrifying figures. These are the sort of figures we have not seen or heard since the economic depression about close to a century ago. But still, as far as the multilateral system is concerned, that has not been operational. If you look at the World Health Organization, again, its credibility has been severely impaired. The Director General of WHO has been seen or has been considered to collude and be complicit with China in misleading the world about the origin and nature of the virus. If, of course, this is the definite feeling around the world that if China had come out honestly and openly, we would not have been in these dire straits as we find ourselves. If it had not allowed millions to leave Wuhan around the middle of January, in the third week of January, and spread out over the world, we would not be staring at such a catastrophe. So in addition to the multilateral system as such, global leadership also has failed. We know that earlier, whether it was in the case of Ebola or it was in the case of the 2008 financial crisis, it was the United States which took the leadership. As I mentioned, at this moment, the United States has stepped backward. It's become more isolationist. It's become more individualistic, not interested in leading the world. And China, which has pretensions, but it has been totally exposed by its behavior at the beginning of the pandemic, not coming out openly, by its wolf warrior diplomacy, by its hubris, by its weaponization of its medicines and medical equipment, like ventilators and face masks, and by supply to several countries of substandard and inferior quality medicines and medical supplies. Of course, it would be pertinent here to mention that women leaders of the world have proved themselves to be comparatively more competent and effective in dealing with the crisis. Whether it is Jacinda Ardern in New Zealand, whether it is Angela Merkel in Germany, or Tsai Ing-wen in Taiwan, Erna Solberg in Norway, or Mette Frederiksen in Denmark, all of them have been able to move forward with a style which has been consensual, which has been inclusive, non-hierarchical, consultative, and communicative. I would imagine that these styles, open, transparent, and honest, these are the qualities of leadership we also need at the global level. Unfortunately, with the two of the pretenders, the United States and China, they do not fit the bill. So going forward, it appears that there could be a concert of middle powers which could provide leadership to the world in rule setting and in governance. My final point is in terms of what do we do as we go ahead? What are the challenges confronting the world and the multilateral system? Number one, we need to ensure that there is no repetition of a similar pandemic. We need to strengthen the World Health Organization, the provisions of its reporting of a pandemic. I remember distinctly in 2018, when the Nipah virus was isolated in Kerala in India. On the second day, the communication went to the WHO, and we were able to combat, confront, and deal with that virus within a couple of weeks. Unfortunately, China's track record has not been very bright in this regard. So whether it is the coronavirus now, or it is the bird flu in 2017, it is the SARS in 2002, it is the Hong Kong flu in the 1968, the bird flu in 1996. All these viruses have emanated from the wet markets of China. So I think going forward, we need to see how the reporting mechanisms can be improved, can be made better. The second challenge would be in terms of the work that is being done on developing the vaccine or the cure for the coronavirus. there is the world's best minds and the best funding is going into this. And what we need to do is that we need to ensure that there is multilateral cooperation and coordination. India can, of course, play a very significant role in this. India has emerged as the pharmacy of the world. Even during this period, it has supplied medicines, whether as grant or on commercial terms, to more than 150 countries, different types of medication. And particularly important would be to reach out to poorer and developing countries, because it is the poorer countries, and even in those countries, those at the bottom of the rung, who the dispossessed people, who would be the least to and the last to get the benefits. So I think what we really need to do is to ensure that this crisis does not go to waste, that we transform this crisis into an opportunity. And my last word would be that India has so far acquitted itself reasonably creditably, notwithstanding the fact that the numbers every day are increasing. But just in terms of numbers, the recovery rate is more than 75%, and the fatality rate is the lowest in the world, just about 2% or so. So India has been following the policy of Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam, which means the whole world is a family. Its position as the chair of the World Health Assembly for this year, its position as the member of the UN Security Council, as a non-permanent member of the UN Security Council for the next 2 years, and as chair of G20 in 2022, provides promising opportunities for promoting cooperation and collaboration in the global community in fighting with this virus and any after effects. Let me stop here, Professor Ganguly, and of course, I'll be happy to take questions and comments as there might be at the end of the session. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that extraordinarily clear and eloquent presentation. We are off to a marvelous start, thanks to you. One could not have expected a better overview of the state of multilateral cooperation, or frankly, the lack thereof, and the complete abnegation of responsibility on the part of the United States and the People's Republic of China, and the complicity of the People's Republic of China in this entire fracas that we find ourselves in. Without any further ado, we will promptly turn to Professor Sham Tekwani of the Daniel Inouye Center, the Asia Pacific Center for Security Studies in Hawaii. And I am enormously grateful to you for joining us for what is undoubtedly a truly ungodly hour in Hawaii.
Well, thank you, Sumit. First of all, Pramod and Nice, thank you very much for this platform to speak. And also hello to familiar faces, Sumit, Smriti, Raji. We've all met at some point or the other before. You may or may not remember, but yes, familiar faces. And hello to everybody I'm not familiar with also. All right, so I have 12, 13 minutes, and I'm going to take this opportunity basically to hit the highlights of a paper I wrote, which is going to be coming out in a day or two, I think. And this is looking at terrorism and counterterrorism in the time of COVID. Now, at the outset, I should say, I'm defining the word terrorism rather loosely. I don't want to get down into the weeds trying to debate what is terrorism and what is not. When I speak about terrorism and counterterrorism here for the purpose of the next 12, 13 minutes, I'm including separatist movements, insurgencies, and what have you, simply because it obviates the need to define what terrorism is, number one. And number two, let's face it, more and more governments these days find the label very convenient when they have to deal with even as something inane as political opponents. So I'll keep the definition a bit wide in this context. So to start off, I also have to offer you the caveat. I know there's this slide behind me. I don't know how to get rid of it, but that's the 25th anniversary of the Asia Pacific Center, which we're celebrating in 3 days from now. I have to reiterate that what I say are my opinions. They do not reflect the opinions of the United States Department of Defense or the Daniel K. Inouye Asia Pacific Center of Security Studies. These are my opinions here. And I'll try and figure out tomorrow how to remove that slide from my back. Okay, all right. So to get to the meat of the matter, every crisis, whether it is man-made or otherwise, offers challenges and, more importantly, opportunities. And this is true for both the people who use violence in pursuit of their political goals, as well as those of us in the business of countering terrorism. Okay, so I'll just offer a few observations. Is terrorism increasing during the time of COVID or not? You're going to hear, if you're interested in the topic, you're going to come across reports offering you both points of view. One point of view is terrorism is on the uptick because of COVID. COVID has provided the opportunities because governments are busy doing other stuff and they've diverted resources, and therefore terrorism is going up. Now, let me tell you, I don't see any evidence this far to indicate that COVID has contributed to an increase in terrorism. What we hear and what we read, half of it is half-baked, and the other half is very ill-informed. I'll give you an example. Some of the media reports, not just media reports, even scholarly writings coming out, at least from this part of the world, they take an example of terrorism on the uptick because of COVID, and they often talk about Kashmir. Now, the correlation is terrible simply because these people were writing reports on using uptick in terrorist activity in Kashmir as an illustration of that being a direct result of COVID, simply do not know that this is seasonal. The snows are melting, people are, the insurgents or terrorists are able to move freely. And every year at this point in time, you will always witness uptick. So to correlate that to COVID is bizarre, is absurd. And as I said earlier, so far, all the reports that I've seen, that I follow, that talk about an uptick in terrorism because of COVID, there's no evidence at all. As I said, it's half cooked and half ignorant. So I don't see any evidence. What it's going to look like after the pandemic is over, it's hard to say. But I think at this point, I will argue that I do not see any evidence to substantiate the argument that COVID has led a rise to attacks and terrorist activity. On the other hand, what is important to know is we are seeing, if people are going to argue that COVID has increased opportunities for terrorists, what we need to see, we can't lose sight of the fact that this also applies to countries and counterterrorism organizations. And I'll give examples again here. Both governments and the bad guys, they are exploiting the environment to what they see is their advantage. Now, this could be in the areas of narratives. It's not just ISIS or a clergyman sitting in Islamabad invoking God to proclaim that the virus is divine retribution on non-believers and that it's divine punishment for its enemies. Governments are doing it. You saw the example in India, Corona Jihad. Where did that come from? That came from governments. It didn't come from radical groups. So there are governments doing the same. In addition to what I mentioned earlier, perverting legal definitions of terrorism, rewriting anti-terrorism laws, curbing media freedoms to prosecute people who are politically opposed to their policies. Then there's an issue of governance. There's concern that provision of services and aid where terrorists demonstrate their public health capabilities and terror groups are often filling in to step the existing vacuum made by governments. We have seen that historically over the last 30 years. You know, I wouldn't worry too much about it, simply because this goodwill that insurgents and groups are able to gain from the local population doesn't last too long, because at some point governments do step in and play the role. So I wouldn't take that as something that one has to lose sleep about. Okay. And a classic example was when we saw the avalanche in Kashmir about a decade ago. Was it a decade ago or less than a decade ago? We saw the Lakshar groups jumping in, providing aid. It didn't last for too long. Likewise, in Sri Lanka during the tsunami, the Tamil Tigers stepped in the eastern part of Sri Lanka. What good did it do to them? Not much. So yes, they will fill in a role. They will fill in that vacuum to gain goodwill, but that goodwill doesn't last for too long. On the contrary, if you did a broad scan of the Indo-Pacific region, I'll come back to this. Most governments are using this opportunity to tighten their grip on their own populations. And one common thread is that the pandemic is providing cover for the war on journalists, civil society organizations. You take India, you take Sri Lanka, you take Philippines. These are three most visible countries doing it. And why do I keep stressing this? On the one hand, I'm telling you, we're not seeing an uptick in terrorist activity because of COVID. On the other hand, what I'm trying to caution us all is when governments do this, when they take advantage of this for their own purposes, you are creating an environment which will enable insurgency, which will enable terrorism. And don't forget, after COVID, we are all going to be looking at a huge economic downturn and also unemployment, and add to that youth bulge in South Asia, for instance. So you have unemployment, you have poor education access, you have a bad economy, and you have angry young people. What are you going to do with that? How are you going to prepare yourself for that? So that's something I think I would be more worried about than worrying about ISIS or Lakshar-e-Toiba taking advantage of COVID. We haven't seen any attack, the magnitude of the Easter attacks in Sri Lanka or Mumbai attacks or even the bakery attacks in Dhaka. We haven't seen any of that happen during COVID. Neither have we seen something similar in Southeast Asia like what happened in Marawi 4 or 5 years ago. We haven't. So I really don't think we have to worry about those kind of big attacks, but we do have to worry about what governments like Sri Lanka, militarization of the entire civil government. India, civil protests are labeled terrorism. People are being picked up just because they protested. Students, media, of course, forget media. There's no media in India. So basically what you're doing is you're also stoking Islamophobia even more greatly. Pakistan, further militarization. The COVID crisis was taken away from the civilian government's hand and controlled by the military. Malaysia, coronavirus, what did it do? It stroked xenophobia against the Rohingya refugees. So I would say Bangladesh is a case in point. You had a massive cyclone during COVID. Were any terrorists able to exploit that chaos and conduct another bakery kind of attack? No, it didn't. I'll come to Thailand. I made a reference earlier to the 2004 tsunami, which resulted actually in a peace pact between the separatist group in Aceh, GAM, and Jakarta. Compare that to Thailand during COVID. The Thais took a very different approach. When the main separatist group, the BRM, they announced a unilateral ceasefire early in April that it suspended hostilities. But what did the Thai military decide to do? They thought this was an opportunity for them to strike. They struck. And now that whole effort at even bringing about a semblance of peace is blown sky high. So I think what I want to conclude with, I know I've run out of my 12 minutes, but what I want to conclude with is there's not so much activity on the terrorist front, but there's a great deal of activity from the government's side across a few countries I've named. They're most visible. And I think what I would worry about is primarily, what does this mean for us? Is some of the countries will come out of this, at least in the short run, more authoritarian, more polarized, and that equals to instability in the long term. It's going to create instability, political instability. And I spoke about recession, I spoke about unemployment, I spoke about the youth bulge. And so if you see the whole issue in the context where political incentives are aligned towards polarization, incitement, and repression, I think we're looking at greater institutional decay and uncertainty about the future. And that is potentially very volatile and will just provide the right environment for enabling more terrorism in the region. Sumit, I'll end there, and I'm happy to take questions at the end of the session.
Thanks very much, particularly for actually adhering to the time limits, contrary to what you said. You did actually stay within the 12, 13-minute limit. And it's a fascinating counterintuitive argument that you're making that contrary to popular belief, terrorism actually hasn't gotten worse in this era of COVID. But then you end on a very cautionary note about what could befall us in the future. And we should all pay heed to this, and particularly governments need to be alert to the dangers that you have so carefully outlined. Now we turn to Dr. Satoru Nagao, who is a visiting fellow at the Hudson Institute.
Thank you very much. I will use the PowerPoint, so I will share wait.
You wanted to share it?
So, succeeded?
Yes, it's
Okay.
visible.
Thank you very much. I will start my presentation. So, it is honor for me to make presentation in this big seminar. So, title of my presentation is How India, US, Japan, Australia, so-called Quad Corporation, can strengthen support Taiwan. I am Japanese who stay in the US think tank. But I talk about Taiwan and security in the Indo-Pacific today. Because when we think the counter-China strategy, Taiwan is mother. So since April 2020, China has been provoking India, including by the breaching its border, when 20 Indian soldiers were killed in the border clash in June. The Prime Minister Narendra Modi declared that their sacrifice would not be in vain. And the Indian government has been stepping up effort to revamp its China strategy. These efforts include reshaping India's relation with Taiwan. So when Taiwan's President Tsai Ing-wen was sworn in for the second term in May 2020, two members of the parliament from India's ruling BJP, along with acting Director General of the India Taipei Association, sent congratulations. So this clearly indicates a new Indian approach. Also in 2014, Taiwan representative to India had attended Prime Minister Modi's swearing-in ceremony. In 2016, India carefully considered sending a representative to the President Tsai's inauguration, but decided against it. So indeed, it is not only India that is strengthening the relation with Taiwan. The other member of the quadrilateral security dialogue, this means that India, US, Japan, Australia, have also recently upgraded relations. So today I will explain 3 topics one by one. So first one is the Taiwan's significance for the quadrilateral security dialogue countries. And the second one is why now? And third one is what is the best course of action? The first one is Taiwan's significance. There are 3. There are at least 3 reasons why Taiwan is so important to the Quad countries' effort to counter China's strategy. First, Taiwan is located off the coast of China, the core area of Chinese economy, and is strategic location for deterring China's aggression. If Taiwan is collaborating with the United States or Japan to exert military pressure on China's coastal area, then China cannot focus its defense budget or military forces on the India-China border area. So moreover, Taiwan is located between East China Sea and South China Sea. And thus Beijing cannot concentrate its naval forces without going through the sea near Taiwan. Second, Taiwan is an important source of information on China. When the COVID-19 pandemic began, Taiwan proved the worth of its knowledge of China, identifying precisely what was happening there in December 2019 and warning the World Health Organization, WHO, of the possibility of pandemic. At the same time, Taiwan was prepared for pandemic, and one reason for its great success in addressing the crisis. The same holds true for the military and economic situation. For India, the US, and Japan, and Australia, Taiwan can be a very important source of information about China. Third, cooperation with Taiwan can be effective diplomatic card for the India, US, Japan, Australia to wield in the response to China's provocation, which have been escalating. When Chinese ship enters the territorial sea around Japan's Senkaku Island, for example, Japan warship could respond with a friendship visit to Taiwanese port. Since China's claimed Taiwan as a part of territory, this is the proper response. We haven't done, but we can do. So in addition, because Taiwan is a democratic, it could be a model of the democracy for Chinese speakers. So, second, why now? Despite Taiwan's importance, India, US, Japan, Australia might lose Taiwan because Beijing has been stepping up its pressure on Taipei since President Tsai Ing-wen took office in 2016. Taiwan is facing diplomatic isolation. The COVID-19 crisis has made many countries aware that Taiwan cannot join the international organization like WHO because of China's opposition. In addition, since June 2017, Panama, Dominican Republic, Burkina Faso, El Salvador, and Solomon Islands on the Kiribati have abandoned formal diplomatic relations with Taiwan as a result of Chinese efforts, including economic assistance and infrastructure projects. This leaves only 15 countries with formal diplomatic relations with Taiwan. She is a leader of the President Tsai Ing-wen, when she addressed in the Hudson Institute, my working place. The Chinese government has also tried to diminish her popularity. For example, in July 2019, Beijing banned travel to Taiwan by individuals, causing the number of Chinese travelers to Taiwan to drop by nearly half between 2050 to 2090. So China intends to harm the economy of Taiwan and decline her popularity. And China's rapid military modernization is changing the military balance with Taiwan. China is provoking Taiwan military and its activity on the Pacific side of Taiwan, where the Chinese aircraft carrier battle group recently made repeatedly visits are of particular concern. And if Chinese armed force deploys there permanently, this would cut Taiwan off from the US and Japan. So Chinese submarine activity are also cause for concern. Moreover, during the COVID-19 crisis, Chinese fighter jets have repeatedly entered Taiwan's airspace. So, what is the best course of action? There are at least 3 steps we can take. First, we should save the Taiwan from diplomatic isolation. In May 2020, during the COVID-19 pandemic, these countries, we attempt, ultimately unsuccessful, to support Taiwan's effort to attend the WHO's World Health Assembly. Moreover, when the El Salvador, Panama, Dominican Republic established diplomatic relations with China and dropped Taiwan in 2018, United States recalled its ambassadors from these countries. Efforts like these must continue. And the countries that dropped Taiwan in favor of China were interested in Chinese investment. If the Quad countries would collaborate with Taiwan on joint projects in the 15 countries that recognize Taiwan, this would be an effective counterweight to China. 4 of these 15 countries are in the Indo-Pacific countries and are under heavy pressure from China. For example, Chinese tourists were a very important source of income for Palau. But in 2018, China banned its citizens from visiting the Destiny Island, Palau, in order to force Palau to establish diplomatic relations with Beijing and end its relation with Taipei. India, US, Japan, Australia, and Taiwan should collaborate to support countries like Palau. Second, the Quad countries should assist Taiwan in relocating factories from mainland China to other US allies and friendly countries, such as India. Taiwanese factories in China benefit both Taiwan and China, but China can use them as a hostage in order to control Taiwan. Third, the Quad countries should build up Taiwan's defense capabilities. The US has supplied Taiwan with weapons for many years, but because of the China's opposition, Washington must address the situation carefully each time and decide whether to proceed with the sale. The best option would be for Taiwan to produce its own weapons, and the Quad countries should support this. As an example of Taiwan's effort to produce its own weapons occurred in 2018. To respond to China's naval move on the Pacific side of Taiwan, Taipei need to conventional submarine. However, its fleet was obsolete, and the US lacks the technology to develop new conventional submarines because all US-built submarines are nuclear powered. Taiwan decided to start the indigenous submarine project. However, Taiwan lacked the capability to build its own, so had to ask the other countries to assist with the design. As a result, 2 companies from US and Europe and 1 from India and Japan bid for the tender. In this case, Japan's proposal was interesting. The Japanese contractor employed engineers who had worked at submarine manufacturers were now retired. Also, they are not familiar with the latest technologies. Because Japan has a world-class conventional submarine technology, the engineer can design submarines that are sophisticated enough to handle Chinese submarines. So, given the diplomatic hurdle, it is easier to use retired officials. So, India, US, Japan, Australia need to Taiwan to help them respond to China's irresponsible behavior. Now is the time for Quad countries to accept Taiwan as an equal partner and support its effort. That's my opinion, and thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much, Dr. Nagao. That was an extraordinarily clear presentation with a very coherent argument and spelling out the policy options that are available to the Quad to help Taiwan. It's a fascinating, provocative, and thoughtful presentation, and I'm sure it'll generate questions. We will turn now to Dr. Rajeshwari Pillai Rajagopalan from the Observer Research Foundation in New Delhi.
Thank you, Professor Ganguly, and thank you to the organizers, both the organizations, for inviting me. This is a huge effort spread over 3 days, a massive effort, and kudos to the organizers for getting us all together. Thank you for this opportunity to be part of this, and I will try and focus in my presentation to look at, try and provide an Indian perspective on what the emerging Indo-Pacific strategic order might look like, or at least provide what the Indian goals are in pushing for the strategic order in the region. So the idea of the Indo-Pacific has been gaining ground in the last few years. Of course, the changing balance of power in Asia and beyond does offer immense opportunities for India to take a proactive role in shaping the emerging Indo-Pacific strategic dynamics. But it calls for New Delhi to have a clearer understanding of the kind of Asia it wants to see and the kind of role it wants to play in this region. India, for instance, has articulated a couple of different important goals. One, it has said that it wants to see a non-hegemonic Asia. That is, it does not want to see an Asia that is dominated by one single power. Former Foreign Secretary and the current Foreign Minister, Dr. Jaishankar, has made this point many times, and it's amply clear who he's talking to or referring to when he says no hegemonic Asia. He's clearly referring to China, because no other country in the region has really the capacity to dominate the region. A related articulation is that India would like to see a multipolar world and a multipolar Asia. It is not certain that it is going to lead to a stable Asian strategic order, but this has been sort of the rhetoric that is played in the Indian context and in the Indian debates. A second important goal that India has articulated is that India has stated multiple times that it wants to see a rules-based order. India has made this emphasis on respect for international law, rules of the road, and this is evidence in its position on some of the regional issues. For instance, on India's position regarding the South China Sea, for instance, is unusually strong, considering that it is a dispute distant from Indian shores. This also ties into a concern that India and many of its regional partners have about the increasing likelihood of American inattentiveness in the face of the growing Chinese power. There is greater recognition that China's mounting belligerence requires a regional balancing effort, therefore. This has led India to build closer strategic partnership with countries like Japan, Australia, Singapore, Vietnam, both in terms of security and defense cooperation, and these have become the primary drivers of many of these engagements. These engagements also include growing military exchanges, bilateral as well as multilateral exercises, and even potentially weapon transfers in the future. There is nevertheless a clear recognition that the US is necessary part of the necessary part of the regional security configuration, despite the fact that there is hesitancy or sometimes unwillingness on the part of the US from time to time, or possibly because of it, there is greater willingness on the part of countries like India and its many other partners in the region to shoulder an even bigger responsibility, including military burden, as a way of convincing the US to stay committed in Asia. In fact, the new regional security alignments are in addition to the US-led security arrangements, as well as to supplement to them. These new alignments and formations are also possibly to circumvent any possible reduction in the presence and the US role of the US role in Asia. But there are several deficiencies in the formulation. The first is the lack of capacity, especially military capacity, on the part of countries like India to carry out effective balancing against China. The second is the absence of willingness to clearly identify the primary motivation for concepts like the Indo-Pacific, for instance, which is China. And this has to be addressed front and center of our debates. India, as well as many other smaller nations in the region, have resisted from identifying China as the main reason for this new security activism that is seen in the Indo-Pacific. India's own efforts from time and again to find strategic space to accommodate China have made India's stand on the Indo-Pacific far less convincing from time to time. A third set of issues is that even though there is a common, if unstated, recognition of the China problem, there are different areas of focus for different countries that could possibly drive these potential allies in different directions. For instance, the US, Japan, Australia, and New Zealand are far more focused on the Pacific and South China Sea, whereas India is more concerned about China's growing footprint in the Indian Ocean, rightly so. Therefore, one issue that needs to be resolved is to bring about a more effective Indo-Pacific strategy, is to have a better coordination between these different sets of concerns, even though they all might be about China. Greater clarity could push way for certain amount of burden sharing, but I think that's some distance away. Though every country does not have to get involved in every region, without some clarity, coordinated action and burden sharing are not going to be possible. So to identify some of these issues, I think there are going to be these coordination mechanisms as well as the capacity issues that need to be addressed and that needs to be built up in a sense. Let me just conclude. I think, the time. So given the overall Indian interest not to see a hegemon dominating Asia, India has a unique opportunity to play a determined role in shaping the Indo-Pacific strategic order. India itself has argued for a multipolar, non-hegemonic Asia, and its growing economy could add to the capacities, but I think there are still capacity gaps that cannot maintain any balance in Asia on its own. It's also India is geographically too far away and does not have, again, sufficient capacity to project power in East and Southeast Asia. India's growth and emergence as a major strategic factor will force also China to adopt a more hardline policy, especially on political and strategic issues, which has been something that we have been seeing in the recent past. The consequence is likely to be increased competition, not only between China and India, but also across the Indo-Pacific. Continuation of such a trend will push India closer to the US and US allies such as Japan, Australia, and others, who remain concerned about the strategic consequences of China's rise. But I think this could also give way for more formulations such as the Quad Plus, which is currently engaged in the COVID-19 context, but I think these could also gain greater strategic purpose in the post-COVID scenario. I'll stop here, and I think hopefully I've been within the time limits. Thank you, and I look forward to any questions and comments thereafter. Thank you.
You've been well within the time limits. And once again, we've gotten yet another extraordinarily clear presentation, extraordinarily lucid, spelling out what India needs to do to play a more significant role in the Asia Pacific, especially as it seeks to counter China's growing presence in the Asia Pacific and its increasingly not just assertive but aggressive behavior. But also Dr. Rajagopalan's presentation underscores the hesitation of India to step forward, and more importantly, the lack of adequate capabilities to address the kinds of challenges that it is confronting. And it is this issue of capabilities, I think, that is especially important, because the will can be mustered, but if you do not possess the requisite sinews to carry out this strategy, and no amount of will get you there. Again, we've been blessed with a superb presentation, in fact, a series of extraordinary presentations this morning. And on that note, we will turn to Dr. Smruti Patnaik from the Manohar Parrikar Institute for Defense Studies and Analysis in New Delhi.
Good evening to my fellow panelists from India, and good morning to you, Sumita. And it is great to be part of this panel. In fact, in between, during the day, I was thinking I was not feeling well, so I was in double mind. But then the moment I felt well, I sent a message to Pramod to tell him that, no, I will participate in this particular panel where I'm going to speak. Basically, what I have done is that my topic is global power transition and India, and this is and power transition is not something new in international relations, because it is not static in that sense. So all the time we see this transition. So the thing is, when you look at this power transition, you look at the India's role, because here we are not speaking of the India of the 1980s or the India of 1947. We are speaking of India which in the past more than a decade or so saw very extensive economic growth, where this question many of the Indians also thought perhaps the time has come for India to play a larger global role, which it had always aspired, and didn't have the wherewithal in that sense to go about the kind of role which its founding father had always seen. Now, when one look at this global power transition in India, I think there are certain things one notice, and I think this is very much debated and discussed in many of the academic forum. Like, for example, the relative decline of the United States. I would not say an absolute decline, because in any kind of power transition, it is not an absolute decline. It is very slow, and one cannot, even if one speak of a downward spiral of any particular power, but then again, there are capacity of the state where it can come back. And the relative decline of the United States also see how it has changed its engagement with different other powers. Like, for example, in this context, I would say the India-US relations, the Quad and all probably will come, when you have a relative decline. So you have a constellation of countries which in fact put forward the kind of power position which you want to take in the global affair. Second is the rise of China, which one has seen very, very, impressive economic growth. And within Asia, one also is witnessing the rise of not just India, but Japan, and of course, in the Indo-Pacific, you have Australia. And like, for example, few years back, many people had written of Russia, as a kind of country which can really make a contribution to the power transition, or will become an assertive, country which can play, play a major role. I think reassertion of Russia is also one is noticing. And all this while one see a lot of change in India's traditional friendship with the Russia on the one hand, the former Soviet Union, and on the other hand, the newly, a kind of relationship which it has developed with the United States post nuclear test. So here, when you look at this, there is this fear in India that the Russia's own relationship with China, and also Russia's relationship with Pakistan is something which India is also closely watching. So in this kind of global power transition, what happens is that many of the countries are looking at multi-alignment. I really do not know whether one can use this term alignment, but I'm using it in a very loose sense in terms of countries coming together and not, it is not the either or of the Cold War period, but you can have multi-alignment with depending on what your priorities, national priorities are. So what does power transition means for India? So the question here is that, is there a power vacuum? I don't think so in that sense. Yes, a decline of a hegemonic power necessarily does not leave a kind of power vacuum, where only one country has a space. I think the power vacuum, which if one say that, to some extent is there, it is basically, many other countries are vying for a kind of multipolarity. So it is not, no more one is speaking of the unipolarity of the United States and its dominance on various global institutions, especially the Bretton Woods system. But here you are also looking at other countries which are coming up in terms of, due to the globalization, due to the new power constellation which one is watching. So that also has an impact on global power balance. So here the choice is not like if one takes that China is emerging and United States is declining. So again, I would say it's not the Cold War period where you have to choose either or, because globalization does not give you that kind of space to choose either or. And moreover, most of the countries are very much intertwined in terms of the globalization, the trade, the market and everything. So that does not allow, in a sense, to have a kind of, the people speak about new Cold War, but you are not going to have the same kind of configuration as one had during the Cold War period. So on the one side, as far as India is concerned, you see in West Asia, there is a transition in terms of India's own relationship with many of the countries in West Asia. For example, the United Arab Emirates with Saudi Arabia, relationship has improved very, very significantly compared to the past. And that could be also one of the reason, in spite of Pakistan trying to get to activate the OIC, it has not been successful. But also at the same time, in the Muslim world, you see Turkey is emerging as a kind of challenger in the if one takes the Muslim world kind of monolithic. So there is a kind of competition between various countries in West Asia. So the question here is that how does India look at West Asia? I would say that in terms of course, the energy factor is there. I think what has now, has occupied the center space is the counterterrorism kind of cooperation, and like the many of the people who are accused of terrorism in India has been handed over by UAE and Saudi Arabia because of India's own excellent relationship. Of course, the US is withdrawing from West Asia, so you see China and Russia are emerging as two major countries which are vying for influence. One has seen this in the context of Syria, what is happening. Russia's own relationship with Israel is also improving. And recently we saw UAE, is also forging ties, normal diplomatic ties with Israel. So you have a kind of power configuration which is coming, where India is much more cautious about the kind of role, it can play. It doesn't have that much of space like China and Russia, but it indeed has some space where it can play a significant role. And what also affects India is, I would say, the Afghanistan-Pakistan region, and this is one of the very important regions where US is, is withdrawing, and one see, the kind of violence, one is going to witness in this region is definitely going to have an impact. So what does India do? So there is this policy of whether India can move into this space in Afghanistan in terms of its linkages to the Central Asian countries, and also, its ties with Iran in terms of Chabahar. But the recent media reports, which was again dismissed by India, of losing out the railway project in Iran, which basically the Iranians said that they, India was never part of that railway project. But nevertheless, I think the slowness of implementing some of the project, like for the North-South transport corridor and all, probably will provide India a greater connectivity to this region, because unless and until you have the physical connectivity, geopolitics will not help, because you have to have a kind of economic influence. Economically, of course, due to globalization, you have massive infrastructure projects which is coming about. The BRI is there, which is going to really change the manner in which the countries are going to deal with each other. And also at the same time, globalization also has an impact on the global governance. Now the question is, how does it impact India? All these factors. I think perhaps India has been trying for a very long time to be part of the United Nations Security Council, which I don't think is coming now unless until there is a reform which takes place. And given the factor that how India and China are dealing with each other, I don't think China will ever be supportive of a reform process where it can bring in its rivals in Asia like Japan and India to the Security Council. Similarly, in the NST, again, there is this Chinese challenge which has come about, which is saying that you formulate rules how countries can be members. So indirectly, in terms of while it is pushing for a kind of, it may appear that China is more interested in not building in terms of the admission of members to the NST, but perhaps I think what it has in mind is Pakistan's membership of the NST. So there, in terms of the global governance, India cannot be a major player because of the institutional, the structural impediment which is there. So the question here is that, like Professor Ganguly was speaking about, this India's own capacity building. I think we have been extremely reticent, in terms of our decision making. Like for example, if Rajesh spoke about the Quad, and if you look at the Quad, the decision regarding going full-fledged on the Quad, you have seen the Malabar exercise where Japan was invited only once. Then there was the second time they did not invite. So it is continuing. Of course, Australia was also reluctant to get to become part of Quad. So I think perhaps somewhere we need to give a clear message. So all the time, weighing and counterweighing your, which is good in terms of the foreign policy, but some of the time the decision actually drags for too long, and it is not very, very clear what exactly India wants in terms of its engagement with the other emerging power, and also how it is looking at the global power transition. So here, the question comes, like the United States has always said, if India wants to be a global power, that means it has to share responsibility. So that is where perhaps the capacity of Indian state to take on the global responsibility comes about. But that is also where, the norms, the institution also comes about, because unless and until there is institutional space to accommodate India, I really do not think India can play a very significant role. So the counter, a kind of counter institution in terms of the AIB, BRICS and all, probably will not proceed as much as it was expected given the current India-China relationship. So therefore, I think India needs to be very vocal and clear about what exactly, where does it figure in the power configuration, and what is the kind of roadmap it has to play a larger global role. So I will end here, and I look forward if there is any questions.
Thank you very much, Smriti. This is a very important topic, the question of power transition, the global power transition and its impact on Asia, and particularly India. And you've provided a detailed discussion of the reactions of various powers in Asia, and especially India, and have outlined what India needs to do to maintain or to boost its role in this time of a power transition. Now we will turn to the final presentation of this panel from Mr. Kin Muang So from the Myanmar Institute of Strategic and International Studies. The floor is yours, sir.
Good evening, sir. Thank you very much for the opportunity. And I am really appreciate the initiative of the Nepal Institute of International Cooperation and Engagement and Water Policy Center for this initiative. I'm going to speak on 27-word presentation topic of avoiding extinction by promoting internationalism amid power transition and COVID-19, securing the stable, strong, and strategic collaboration for the actualization of the 21st century as Asian century. The idea of my topics came from a couple of sources, including a recent book by the Professor Noam Chomsky, The Internationalism or Extension. And my interaction with many foreign friends from United States, China, India, Bangladesh, and some of ASEAN countries, and my frequent visit to China and India. My visit to China and India cover my visit to Tibet Autonomous Region and the frequent visit to the Northeast India, especially the Imphal, Manipur state. This opportunity remind me of a word of wisdom of Mr. Desmond Tutu. And he said, and I quote, "Don't raise your voice, improve your argument." The COVID-19 pandemic, which started with Wuhan, China in December 2019, is an alarming call to a war with 7.8 billion Homo sapien. The human war is full of controversy, conspiracy, and conflict because many people have many differences in ideology, economics, ethnicity, emotion, and education. The change is constant and inevitable with history, different economy, and demographic of a nation in the world. If the world leaders fail to make right decision, the entire human planet will become extinct. It is very obvious that we are experiencing a power transition, which is a cyclical nature in nearly more than 300-year history of the nation state. According to Swedish professor A.F.K. Organsky, a power transition is a transition in which a dominant global power is at least somewhat declining and a new global power is rising. During a power transition, risks of conflicts and even war can run high. History rise and history fall. History repeats itself. Thucydides' trap must be prevented from further developing during and beyond COVID-19. Myanmar is a developing country, but Myanmar is dedicated to be a part of solution to problem, but not a problem to the solution. Myanmar people are struggling to cope with mounting international pressure because of the big power rivalry and geopolitical competition. Myanmar cannot be, any small nation cannot be the power gained by any giant's power near and far. Every sovereign state has rights to exist without being discriminated unless it breaks international law. The Myanmar is determined to help America and China escape to CDD trap together with friendly nations who believe strongly in the principle of peaceful coexistence. Taking this opportunity of the various scholars from many countries, I would like to draw your attention to the study more about Myanmar growing geopolitical significance. The President Obama, the former US President Obama visited Myanmar in 2012 and he made a speech at famous Yangon University. I came here because of the importance of your country. You live at the crossroads of East and South Asia. You border the most populated nation on the planet. You have a history that reaches back thousands of years and the ability to help determine the destiny of the fastest growing region of the world. I'm not exaggerating. Myanmar geopolitical significance amid power transition and COVID-19 is getting higher and higher than what President Obama said in 2012, Myanmar had to intervene between the US and China in July 2020 after the media argument on their respective embassy Facebook in Yangon. They exchanged blame on South China Sea and Hong Kong issue. Myanmar Foreign Ministry urged both China and the US to maintain good relationship through exercising restraint. And for the sake of international peace and security, every nation is to promote internationalism. Internationalism is the belief of real Homo sapien, wise human being, that different country, different people, and different culture can achieve more advantages by working together and trying to understand each other than by arguing, finger pointing, and fighting war with each other because of extreme nationalism and ultra-exceptionalism. We are to see things as they really are, without injecting bias into any situation to navigate the complexity of international relations, which is under heavy influences of various conspiracy theory. The evidence-based and data-driven analysis reveal that Asian century is really entering amid COVID-19 pandemic and the sharp decline of US liberal democracy. The Professor Amita Acharya, a well-known scholar, once he said, Trump is consequence, not the cause of the crisis and decline of liberal world order. Trump cannot revive US global hegemony, but he is more likely to destroy the US base and lead world order than restore US primacy. Emerging power could be severed if they overcame China-India tension, China regional problem, and domestic weaknesses in others. Globalization is not dead, but is taking a new form, led more by East and the West, based more on South-South than North-South linkages, and focusing more on development than trade. It is going to be multiplex, not a unipolar or multipolar world. The Professor Amita Acharya is not only the one who tried to explain the problem with the US. Another US dignity, Professor Joseph S. Nye, revealed his inconvenient truth about President Trump in his book entitled Globalization and Its Discontent Revisited Anti-Globalization in the Era of Trump. Donald J. Trump became president of the United States on January 20, 2017, and threw a hand grenade into the global economic order. The arrangement governing the movement of goods, services, and capital across border and attempting to ensure stability. The US was pivotal in creation of this system in the aftermath of World War II. Partly because of this system, the second half of the 20th century was markedly different from the first half, which was marred by two world wars and the Great Depression. The smoke has yet not cleared, but the post-Trump war will almost surely be different from what came before. While for 3/4 of a century effort had forced on creating a more globally integrated world entailing global supply chain that has enormously lowered the cost of goods. Trend reminded everyone, border do matters. History revealed that fall of empire or nation is mainly because of internal weaknesses, Sorry, sir. The history reveals the fall of empire or nation is mainly because of internal weaknesses than external pressure. The ubiquitous phrase of foreign policy is an extension of domestic policy, can enlighten international relation practitioner, policymaker, and academician at any age of history. I repeat, foreign policy is an extension of domestic policy. The concept of 21st century as Asian century parallel the characterization of 19th century as Britain imperial century and the 20th century as the American century, in which both the politics and culture of United Kingdom and US dominated the rest of the world. The rest of the story of 19th century and 20th century is now part of the world history. History is alive and exciting. In 1942, the Mahatma Gandhi expressed his vision, the potential of China and India. As a friend of China, I long for the day when a free China and free India will cooperate together in friendship and brotherhood for their own good and for the good of Asia and the world. A 2011 study by the Asian Development Bank found that an additional 3 billion Asians could enjoy living standards similar to those in Europe today, and the region could account for over half of global output by the middle of this century. And it also stated that the Asian century is not preordained. The growing importance and emphasis of unity in Asia, as well as maturing and progressive relationship among countries in the region, further solidifying the century creation of the 21st century as Asian century. Even in 1924, the scholar named Karl Horsford used the term Pacific Age. He predicted the growth of Japan and China and India. To make a long story short, countries in East, South, and Southeast Asia desperately need to stand in solidarity and must not be divided by others who are becoming weaker and weaker domestically. Having said that, it doesn't necessarily mean that Asian countries must be hostile to other countries, but we are to play a complementary role to make a better world for everyone. Asian century must empower the United Nations, which is of paramount importance for avoiding human extinction because of great power, rivalry, and geopolitical competition. In my humble opinion, India deserves to join the United Nations as a permanent security member with the Security Council to counterbalance China through soft balancing. Things are indicating that post-pandemic world order will be built in Asia. Countries in East, South, and Southeast Asia are forced to explore all possibility to secure and enhance the stable, sound, and strategic collaboration for the actualization of 21st century as Asian century. In conclusion, everything that irritates us about others can lead us to understanding of ourselves. And people, organization, and nation don't have a real power unless they really empower others. Thank you very much for your kind attention. Thank you, sir.
Thank you very much for a fascinating discussion on the possibilities and prospects of an Asian century. Our panelists have now formally come to a close. We will open the floor up to questions and comments. Please use the chat function on your Zoom, which is at the bottom of your panel, and you can send in a message either privately to me or to the entire group, and I will address your question in the order it was received. We have close to half an hour, and so we can make full use of our time. I am deeply grateful to this panel for a series of thoughtful and intriguing presentations. It is a pity that Ambassador Sazenhaar had a prior engagement and had to leave us, and we will not be able to engage him further, but we have the rest of the panel with us, and I would, oh, Ambassador Sazenhaar is back. So we do have an opportunity to engage with him, and so feel free to ask him questions. You can direct questions either to the entire panel or to a specific member of the panel, and if you do the latter, please indicate whom you are directing this question to. The first question comes from the former director of the Nehru Memorial Museum and Library, my friend, Mr. Shakti Sinha. And the question is, taking off from your reactions, meaning my reactions to Dr. Rajagopalan's outstanding presentation, does she think that India would even be able to summon the will to help strengthen Taiwan's defense on the lines outlined by Dr. Nagao? So the question is for Dr. Rajagopalan.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Ganguly, and of course, Dr. Sinha. That's a terrific question, but I think precisely on the question of Taiwan, I think India did have an opportunity to press a serious case, to make a strong case at the World Health Assembly. But again, India did not prefer to take a clear stand on that issue, and it didn't come up to, of course, voting on the subject. But India could have pushed and could have taken a proactive role in pushing for the change in the stature of WHO. But I think India did lose an opportunity over there, and I think this has been the part of the problem. India, even when it is presented with opportunities, now India is going to be part of the Security Council from next year onwards. Again, what kind of a role would India play, as well as not just the Security Council? India also has an important role, and I think to partner with other like-minded countries in reviewing and reforming the multilateral institutions, because you don't want, like Ambassador Sazenhaar said, you don't want a repeat of the pandemic to happen. So WHO was a clear case. The handling of the pandemic in the beginning of the crisis clearly showed the deficiencies of the multilateral functioning. It was hijacked by one single power. The leadership was beholden to one country, and therefore the kind of misinformation campaign that it was engaged in, I think that was a serious issue which made the whole world suffer in this sense. So, and the other institution that comes to my mind again, in particular reference to Taiwan, is the ICAO, the International Civil Aviation Organization. And this is again linked very closely to the pandemic and the Taiwan issue, because even in the middle of the crisis, Taiwan was not getting adequate information on the kind of travel advisories and the kind of notification it should have been able to provide, it should have been able to receive in a sense. And this again linked to, like Ambassador pointed out earlier, the kind of number of people who were traveling out of Wuhan to the rest of the world and so on and so forth, the kind of coordination that happened between WHO, ICAO, and other important power centers. So I think there are a lot of the multilateral institutions need to be reviewed and reformed, and there has to be, especially for countries like Taiwan, it has to play. And given that Taiwan is one of the regional hubs when it comes to a lot of these issues, health-wise, again, the pandemic, COVID-19 pandemic has shown the capacity that Taiwan has in terms of how it can, it has effectively managed the issue, the kind of the health expertise it has, and it had learned a great deal from the SARS health crisis in a sense in the past, and therefore it was able to set up and put in place the capacities to deal with another major crisis of that kind. So it could have been a huge best practices that could have been shared from Taiwan to the rest of the world in terms of how you go about in managing the health crisis. But I think even otherwise, I think it's time for India to take a clearer stand. Taiwan has a greater role to play when it comes to the Indo-Pacific strategic order. And I think we have to look at the critical role that Taiwan can play in that as well. Not just because usually we talk about Taiwan in the case whenever there is an India-China tensions pick up, there's a potential conflict that is kind of happening. Then we talk about Taiwan, Tibet, and all of that as a card. But I think instead of looking at Taiwan as a bargaining chip, as a card, we need to look at proactively promote the role of Taiwan as a strategic partner in the Indo-Pacific region, in a sense, as an area, as a country that can promote stability and prosperity in the region.
Thank you very much for a comprehensive and thoughtful response to Shakti Sinha, Mr. Shakti Sinha's question. Once again, I wanted to remind everyone we are delighted that Ambassador Sazenhaar is back. So he's certainly someone you can ask a question of or comment on his presentation. I noticed there's a question for me from Mr. Kin Wang So from Myanmar. and it is about my view of the Asian century. Actually, the Asian century in considerable measure depends upon China's behavior. If it continues to behave in this extraordinarily aggressive fashion, it's going to fracture any possibility of Asian cooperation and any notion of Asian solidarity. For all its sweet words, its behavior has completely contradicted it has been contradicted by its actions. I am not a great votary of the Belt and Road Initiative, which I see mostly as a debt trap and could be potentially quite costly to a number of countries that, in my judgment, have foolishly embraced it and could find themselves in extraordinarily difficult circumstances. So I am somewhat skeptical about the possibilities of an Asian century. Much as someone of Asian descent, I would like to see that happen.
Thank you, sir. Thank you very much, sir.
Thank you. And the floor is open for questions and comments. So we still have a good 25 minutes on hand. So please do take care, step forward. I see a question from Utkarsha Mahajan. My question is for the entire panel. How do you see the China's digital Silk Road and space Silk Road can be balanced by other global powers? Would anybody like to respond to that question? The floor is open to any of the panelists. And Ambassador Sazenhaar has just asked the host to unmute him. So Pramod, would you please unmute Ambassador Sazenhaar?
I've just been unmuted, Professor Ganguly, and if you—
Wonderful.
Yeah, if you permit, I could take a shot at this question.
Please.
And also, if you permit, I could just add one sentence to, the very comprehensive response that was given by Professor Raji Rajgopalan to the other question on Taiwan.
Yeah.
Okay, so the first thing on Taiwan, I think when the World Health Assembly met in May this year, then the focus of the whole international community was to get a decision from the WHO about an independent, impartial investigation into the origin of the pandemic or origin of the coronavirus. So in that sense, this resolution that came from the European Union, maybe it was not the best of resolutions. It was a highly watered down resolution. But I think everyone wanted to get something off, and they were very apprehensive, I guess, because of what China has been able to do on Hong Kong, on the Uyghur issue, because you would remember that in Hong Kong, there were 22 countries which came up and said, criticized, went to the UN Secretary General, General Assembly, saying that, what China is doing there is against international provisions. And China was able to bring in about 37 countries which said, that whatever it is doing is perfectly within its right. And something similar it was able to do in the case of the treatment, the so-called education centers or the concentration camps in Xinjiang as far as the Uyghurs are concerned. So I think the world was concerned whether China might again be able to marshal some of these countries. And the focus was on getting that resolution. So it was thought that maybe Taiwan could be postponed to later this year. So I guess it will come up at the end of the year. And the last comment there I would make is that, yes, I take it that India could have been more proactive, more forthcoming. But I would take it more as a failure of the international community to bring Taiwan onto the, the observer status of the World Health Assembly as it was before 2016, rather than a failure only of India. Because I think whatever we are doing right now, it has to be done in a concert of, let us say, either, whether it is democracies, D10, or, some of the other countries, coming together rather than individual countries taking a stand and trying to take it forward. We saw that this move for an investigation came from Australia, but then very quickly there was a critical mass that got around it. So I think this is something going forward that India, Japan, and all the other countries will really need to look at and devise a strategy of their own in terms of going forward. Now, the question that has been posed in terms of the digital Silk Road and the space Silk Road, I think the BRI projects in very many parts of the world are under enormous stress because of shortage of funding and shortage of resources. I know I look very closely at Central Asia, Southeast Asia, and I know that many of those countries have gone to China and asking for a debt waiver. Many countries I know in Africa have gone to China and asked for a debt waiver because things are not going too well. As we've seen, the economies on all the countries have come down. So I think if barring some of the very critical and crucial areas, like maybe through Kazakhstan, where China might be willing to put in that money and that resources, I think the other areas it might have to wait for some more time for Chinese economy itself to get better. Because as we know, in the last People's Congress earlier this year, China failed even to declare what its GDP growth is going to be. So the situation and the circumstances are very, very uncertain. And I don't think that China will be able to muster all the resources to put in these areas, while the SREB, the Silk Road Economic Belt, and the Maritime Silk Road, they themselves are facing shortages of assets and resources. So in brief, this is, I think, definitely on paper, it is something that China would like to take forward. But I think in practicality, it really might have to wait for quite some time. Thank you.
Thanks very much for a very thoughtful and sort of comprehensive response to the question. We'll have to move on because there are other questions popping up in the chat box. One of them is, how likely is it that people will forget about China in 1921 after the COVID-19 and the US election? Anyone want to take a crack at that?
Yeah, I can.
Thanks, Raji.
Yeah, absolutely. So, absolutely. No, I think this is China is not 2021. I don't think we are going to be forgetting the impact of the COVID-19, because the COVID-19 impact is going to stay with us for a very long time, whether it is in terms of economic, social, and political impact of the COVID is very, very significant. As you know, the whole crisis, the COVID-19 pandemic originated in China, but China has been able to, through whatever means, at least by going by some reports, have been able to limit the impact, but it has spread to the rest of the world and has created havoc in terms of every facet of our lives. So I don't think the COVID can be forgotten in another come next year. I think we are going to be forgetting the impact of it, because the impact is going to stay with us for everything. And starting from the economy, the defense, given the economic impact, I think countries are also looking at reducing their defense budget, for instance. And I think this is something that is going to have a huge impact on the kind of Indo-Pacific strategic order, or anything that we want to talk about in this is security and strategic side of things. Countries like India are already kind of slashing their defense budgets. Countries like South Korea already announced slashing their defense budget. So the economic impact is also going to be felt in the economic, in the defense and strategic sectors. So that given this kind of impact, and at the same time, China has persisted with its aggressive behavior across their neighborhood and even far away from their neighborhood. countries like Canada have not been spared, or Sweden. So it's not just the neighborhood using using force, using military force, as well as economic and trade coercion, like countries like Australia, which has been bearing the brunt of that. Again, countries like New Zealand, each of these countries have been bearing the brunt of Chinese aggressive behavior. So I don't think, and their lack of now capacity, which has been exacerbated by the COVID-19 pandemic, I doubt that people are going to be, the countries or the leaders are going to be forgetting the impact created by the COVID-19 pandemic, which originated in China. So I think these are issues that are going to stay in a sense with us for a very long time. And I think this is also going to complicate a lot many more our equations with each other and so on and so forth. For instance, I think one of the results of this is also going to be how countries in the region, in the Indo-Pacific region, will like to kind of relate to each other. And I believe that there are going to be a set of emerging multilaterals in Asia, which are going to be useful in creating and revitalizing economic and strategic linkages. And I believe that the thicket of networks are going to come about, which are going to sort of strengthen some of the strategic engagements that are much required in this part of the world, because China problem is not going to go away. Even in the middle of the pandemic, they have been at it. Even countries like, for instance, Indonesia, which would have otherwise would not have preferred to take a very strong stand and so on and so forth. They have been harassed, and the number of naval intrusions have been so many since January onwards. Countries like Indonesia, Vietnam, Malaysia, Philippines, and of course Taiwan and Japan, and now India in the sense. So I think the Chinese aggressive behavior has been such that I think it's very difficult to forget how it has kind of contributed to the current state of the affairs, but at the same time, it has also contributed to our sort of reduced capacity to deal with the because of the COVID impact and so on and so forth. So I think issues are somewhat interlinked, and I think they're very difficult to separate out. But I think the impact, nobody is going to forget that COVID-19 has changed the lives of people in more ways than one, and it's affected practically the whole world.
Professor Ganguly, could I come in for just two sentences, please?
Yes, please.
Because I fully second what Professor Rajgopalan has said. And I guess this question is born out of the fact, when people say that the memory of the public is proverbially short. So, once the pandemic is gone, then everything is forgotten, and China has all the wherewithals to sort of, reach out to the countries. But I think, in my view, this time China did have a great opportunity to reach out to different countries, notwithstanding the mistakes that it made right at the beginning of the pandemic in November, December, January. If it was more empathetic, if it was more kind, if it was more generous, if it was more considerate to reach out to these countries. But China has taken exactly the opposite tack. Maybe it is because of its own domestic compulsions that it has been forced to do that, because Mr. Xi Jinping wants to show that he is a muscular, he is a very strong figure as far as the world is concerned. And even when there has been so much of a pushback, so much of a backlash against it, you see what Wang Yi has been saying in Norway, that if any Hong Kong democracy activist is given a Nobel Prize, it will be seen as something against the country. So I don't know, they don't seem to be learning their lessons. So in that sense, yes, I don't think it is going anywhere. It is definitely going to, China is doing its best to rub it in the minds and consciousness of the people. And the second part was in terms of the US election, whether there's something going to change. Now, I feel if Mr. Trump is going to come, there is more of the same. But if Joe Biden and Kamala Harris were to come, then maybe there might be a change in style and less a change in content. But you being there, I think you would be much better placed than any one of us to comment on that. But this is my 2 pence worth that, I feel that there is a bipartisan consensus, not only amongst the political parties, but business, media, academics, think tanks, etc., across the board, that China this time has really, in a variety of ways, crossed many red lines. And so the United States needs to push back against it. Thank you.
Thank you. Just on the US elections, one sentence, and that one sentence is the following, that not only will there be a stylistic change, but I suspect a substantive shift if Biden and Kamala Harris come to office. But that's a subject of another separate conversation. I noticed that there are already 3 or 4 more questions, so we will move promptly to those. One of them is very specifically directed to Dr. Patnaik, and which is a counterpoint to what we've been talking about China. And someone suggests that given the pervasive China bashing across the world, can we trust media reporting on China?
Yeah, that is true, but I don't think some of the reports which has been coming about everywhere is not something which is not based on certain facts. And I think, most of this report which is coming about on China, on the COVID-19 and whether China is responsible and to what extent China is responsible as far as the spread of COVID-19 to other European countries and to Asia is concerned. But I think in the context of the border, the India-China conflict which is going on, perhaps adds to that kind of, the irresponsibility, quote unquote, of China in the time of the COVID-19, this kind of incursion taking place across in Ladakh is something which has brought a lot of criticism within India itself. And second, of course, as Professor Ganguly was also speaking about the BRI and the kind of debt trap, this is leading to, also brings in the criticism. So one has to look into what are the factors which is actually driving, this criticism against China. So I would say that, these are very, very clear cut. The COVID-19, the failure of China to inform everybody, the kind of, epidemic which was present in Wuhan at that much time, allowing the flight to take off from Wuhan, whereas, internally the flight was almost stopping at that point of time. And of course, this entire debate about the BRI and all. So therefore, it's not about that the press is writing, criticism about China without any kind of basis. Definitely there is a basis, but one can debate about whether some of the reports are exaggerated and not, actually making a lot more than what exactly is happening. I think some of the reports are justified in particular contexts.
Okay, we have about 7 more minutes, and there's a question again from Shakti Sinha about how much can we expect a post-Abe Japan to be committed to raising Japan's profile internationally and in the region? Abe was able to push India, for example. Can his successor do that? I think this should properly go to Dr. Nagao.
Thank you very much, sir. In this question, influence of the Prime Minister Abe is very important because he was the pioneer of the Indo-Pacific concept and the quadrilateral cooperation. Repeatedly, he emphasizes this idea and finally persuades the United States, and the United States start to use this concept. So without him, who can explain this strategy? That is a very important factor. But at the same time, this kind of the strategy not consisted by only one person. The bureaucratic process, through the bureaucratic process, Japanese government materialized this concept. So that is the reason the Japanese next prime minister tried to continue. In this means steadily, the relation between the Japan and other Indo-Pacific countries, including India, will develop. But emotionally, Prime Minister Abe is something special. He is relative of the Indian. His cousin had married with Indian lady, and because of he is quite nationalist, India supports such kind of the mindset of him for a long time. That is the reason his emotion toward India is a little special compared with other Japanese. And so if he resigned from the prime minister, both the Indian side Japanese or India lost a good supporter. So that is true. But in my opinion, he has come back in 2012 after he resigned in 2007. After he recovered from this ill, he will come back, I believe. That is the reason his Indo-Pacific concept or his quadrilateral security diamond will come back again. That is my opinion. Answer. Thank you very much.
Thank you. We have time for one final question, and this is a question about India's neighborhood policy. Would anyone on the panel care to comment on it, particularly those from India?
Can I take it on, Sumita?
Sure, but be very brief because time is extremely limited.
Yeah, I think, you know, in terms of India's neighborhood policy, India has moved from a very security-centric approach as defined by various treaties which India signed in the 1950s, the peace treaty with Bangladesh and those kind of things. So I would say that we have moved from a security-centric approach to a much more economic kind of approach, where we are not looking at the border as, you know, defining India's security, but we are looking at border as a kind of opportunity which needs to be crossed in terms of trade and connectivity. So that I would say that is a major transition in, you know, in India's thinking over the period of time to, you know, its outlook towards the neighborhood. This is the short answer I can give.
Can I just add a two-finger comment? Sumit?
Yes.
Okay. I agree with, just want to add on to something that Smriti has already talked about. But I think we have made a lot of messes in our neighborhood. Whether it is Nepal, whether you could blame it on structural issues and so on and so forth, there are serious problems. But India, being the big neighbor, should be more magnanimous with its neighbors, whether it is Bangladesh. And some of the problems are self-created. We have created the foreign policy challenges for ourselves. Bangladesh, the way in which we went about some of the domestic issues without being considerate to some of our neighborhood, how that's going to be affected, played out. I think that's been our own making in a sense. Nepal, Sri Lanka again is falling into the China's corner in a sense. Again, what did we do? And I think here is the key question, which also ties up with the, for instance, the larger question about the BRI. BRI, you can talk about the debt trap diplomacy issue and so on and so forth. But at the same time, what are the other Indo-Pacific countries doing in order to provide assistance in any which way to these countries? So unless we are able to provide either connectivity projects or other kind of assistance to these countries will keep going back to China. Sri Lanka, in the second year of the debt trap issue, when they had to come up for Sri Lanka, it came for this second installment of the repayment, they went back to China asking for a fresh lease of money. So what happened to all the Indo-Pacific powers that could have played a bigger role, whether it is the US, India being an immediate neighbor, South Asian major power? We didn't do anything about it. So our own neighborhood, we have to be more generous because these are all smaller neighbors. We have to be generous. We have to be magnanimous in dealing with them. Recently, Dr. Jaishankar talked about how there are other politics. Sure, China is trying to take advantage of that situation, but the fact is that we have provided as sort of an opening for China to come in and kind of play a bigger role. China is able to play that bigger role because of us, our own misgivings in a sense.
Just two comments, Professor Ganguly, on this.
Allow me to, because we are literally out of time.
Yeah, but allow me to, because, give a little bit of balance, because, not going into theoretical or IR theory, but on empirical basis. I think as far as Bangladesh is concerned, there are so many new initiatives that have been taken in terms of connecting the Northeast with Chittagong. And I think our partnership is really growing. So I know that more is possible, but as far as Bangladesh is concerned, our relations, if you were to look at it today from what it was 5 or 6 years ago, I think it is much better. As far as Sri Lanka is concerned, the new foreign secretary has just said that India first is in strategic terms our policy which we are following, and that Hambantota was a mistake. I think we need to build upon that. As far as Maldives is concerned, again, we have been able to do considerably well. So I think there are criticisms because people would like to see much more happening. But where we are today, I think we are at a reasonably decent spot as things go. So let me finish here. Nepal, again, we saw the Prime Minister of Nepal calling our Prime Minister on 15th August. So I think there are possibilities of taking this relationship forward. And India will take cognizance of what has just happened in the recent past on Nepal, Bangladesh, when it formulates its policies going forward. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that intervention. I'm afraid I have to bring the proceedings to a close, even though there are questions. I am deeply grateful to Dr. Pramod Jaiswal and to the Water Policy Center for organizing this session and the entire conference. This is a marvelous intellectual effort and a substantial effort involving people literally across the globe in various time zones, for which I am deeply grateful to the panel. And on that note, I will turn the proceedings back to Dr. Jaiswal for a final word, and I'm afraid I have to leave.
Thanks, Sumit.
Thank you for staying up.
Yeah, so let's move to the vote of thanks. And so, yeah, let's start. Yeah. So, distinguished chairs, speakers, ladies and gentlemen, as we come to the end of this session, it is my great honor to propose a vote of thanks on behalf of NICE and WPC. I would like to express gratitude and sincere thanks to Professor Sumit Ganguly for accepting our request to chair the session. Our sincere thanks goes to all speakers for delivering such a comprehensive and insightful presentation. We are honored to have all the speakers with us here today. We would like to acknowledge our gratitude to our friends from the diplomatic community, experts, academia, media, and different organizations. Last but not the least, I must mention our deep sense of appreciation for our audience who has participated in the webinar and those who are watching us live. We are truly honored to have you all with us this morning, evening, and hope to stay connected with you in future as well. I request all of you kindly, yeah, just